Ready?
Yeah.
Okay. Welcome and thank you for joining us for today's COVID-19 Legal Issues Forum, the view from a senator's remote office. We are joined today by Megan Harrington, Toledo Law alumna, class of 2010, and legislative assistant to Rob Portman, U.S. Senator from Ohio. As we have heard in previous forums, COVID-19 has changed and continues to change our world. While this was happening, legislators and their staff were grappling with how to conduct in-person business in the same manner used by the rest of us, remotely. Additionally, legislators needed to act swiftly to provide aid to those in need, both businesses and individual constituents. While the coronavirus health scare is not yet behind us, other serious events are now in the forefront and have the nation's attention. Megan had a remote front row seat to observe and assist with the legislative issues brought about by COVID-19. She will touch on the challenges of legislating quickly and trying to anticipate unintended consequences, remote voting, and some impactful United States Supreme Court decisions. Megan will also talk with us about Senator Portman's response to the violence and injustice against African Americans. My name is Heather Carnes, Assistant Dean of Career Services and Alumni Affairs here at the College of Law. As guests are joining us, I want to share a few notes about our virtual event today. Attendee names are not visible to other attendees. They are only visible to hosts and presenters. Therefore, you will only see your name in the attendee list. For today's presentation, we request that you submit questions using the chat box, which I will be monitoring throughout the session. We will route questions to Dean Barros and the panelists as we begin the latter portion of our session today. To access chat, click on the chat icon at the bottom of your screen. The chat panel will appear in the right bottom column. Additionally, if you would like to change the view on your screen, you can click the upper right corner of your screen to expand or to reduce. Now I would like to turn things over to our moderator for today's session, Dean of the College of Law, Ben Barros.
Thank you so much, Heather. Megan, thank you so much for joining us today. One of the things we always start with in these sessions is we're going to talk about a lot of pretty heavy issues today, but just wanted to start, if you could, because a lot of our viewers are alums and current students and potential students, just give us a little bit of a career recap, how you got to where you are today.
Okay, great. I graduated from UT Law back in 2010. Those were also very interesting times. It was the height of kind of the recession. When I reflect back, not a lot of my classmates had jobs offers had been rescinded in that spring, and it was a tough climate to get a job. I'd spent most of my time in law school working in the city of Toledo in the prosecutor's office and really thought that would be my path. And then after just kind of not hitting any real opportunities in Ohio and in the Northwest Ohio region, I decided to make the move out to Washington. And this was in December of 2010, after the 2010 election. And that was an election where there had been a significant amount of Republican seats that had been acquired in both the House and the Senate. I'd done some work in politics throughout college and law school, but not extensively. And I decided to try to get a job on Capitol Hill. I ended up kind of volunteering and then initially hired as a temporary employee to set up Senator Portman's constituent mail system. And then quickly after that, they decided to keep me on, and I started working on legislative policy. So I've been there for about 9 years. The issues that I cover are immigration, judiciary issues, everything in kind of the hot button world, guns, civil rights issues. I also do our work on human trafficking and opioids, drug abuse, addiction, and recovery, and then labor issues and workforce development. So kind of the full gamut. And I still love Ohio. I still call myself an Ohioan. And fortunately, because I work for an Ohio senator, I get to still vote in Ohio. So I'm glad to be here today.
Okay, thanks. And just one quick follow-up on that. Senators have different type of staff. You're on the legislative side of the House, not the political side of the House. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, so every Senate office is, it's actually really interesting because senators, when they're elected, are really given a budget and they can distribute that among their staffers. There is a cap, a statutory cap for salary. But after that, you can really decide if you want to have a very communications heavy office on the official side, or if you want to have a legislative emphasis, or kind of that's your discretion. On the political side, that's totally separate from legislative policy. So anyone who's working on the campaign or doing that kind of work has no kind of connection with the work that I do. So we're very insulated, and in fact, we're prohibited under law. And follow a very strict code of ethics to not engage in any kind of campaign or political activity.
Got it. And one last career-related question. My impression of working in Capitol Hill and politics is often you have to really start at the bottom, not paid a lot, and then you gradually work your way up. That seems like it was true in your experience.
Yeah, that is the culture on Capitol Hill and maybe in Washington more broadly. It's a great place for individuals and students or people who are just graduating. I think it's a great place to come as a lawyer with little or no experience or with just a really open-ended idea of what you want to do. It's also a place that you might not get this, but it's a very, everybody wants to help everyone else because we all kind of came up from nothing or had that first lower job. And so it's a pay it forward kind of town. And, that's true on both sides of the aisle, among colleagues. And Congress as a whole, I can only speak to the Senate, but working in the Senate, it's a very collegial environment. A lot of the staffers who've been around more than 5 years, I mean, you know each other, you see each other, you see people in the hallway. It's a great place. It almost has a college campus feel.
Okay. Cool. Well, man, maybe we can come back to that when we're talking about some specific legislative issues and how you work with the staff with other senators of both parties to get things done. So this was billed as a COVID conversation, and COVID is still incredibly important, and I'd like to circle back to it. But events of the last 10 days or 2 weeks have kind of overtaken us a little bit. So I just was wondering if you could start by talking about maybe both yours and or the senators' reaction to the killing of George Floyd, and also some of the protest issues that have been coming in the Lafayette Square demonstration and that kind of thing that's have been happening right nearby you in DC.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So last week, although the Senate has been back in session for about a little more than a month, last week, because of the Memorial Day holiday, all of the members of Congress were not in Washington. And so as we kind of saw what happened, everybody was kind of processing it after the George Floyd killing, but nobody was kind of convening yet. I will say the demonstrations, and I live right on Capitol Hill, during this time, and last weekend was the first time when we kind of saw the protests. And what I observed, there were many peaceful protests that were organized by Black Lives Matter and some other organizations. And then at night there had been kind of this escalation of maybe rogue protesters or people who may not have even been involved in the protest, but the looting. And so for the Capitol Hill area, it was, it was hard to take because a lot of businesses had already been closed. I was just kind of making a timeline of when things started shutting down. And by my estimate, it was, everything in the city had basically been shut down since March 16th. And so you had a lot of buildings that already it was, undetermined if they'd reopen. And I think that unfortunately, those actions and the destruction might also complicate that. The White House, the White House reaction on Monday, for the president's photo op is something that I think is very troubling. And I think most members of Congress would agree with that. Senator Portman, did not think it was appropriate. And, there's broader concern about the use of any kind of force on peaceful protesters and just the transparency. I think there's still a lot of questions that we're asking about what type of direction folks were given. It was during a window when DC had not yet been in curfew. There was a 7 o'clock curfew in place. This occurred before then. So there are a lot of concerns about that. And we're still in the information stage of trying to figure out who knew what when and who was really calling the shots. But it was horrifying to watch from a personal perspective to see that. And it's been hard to digest just what Washington looks like and how things are transpiring. I will say over the last couple of nights, there have been increasing larger crowds and almost no violence in the aftermath. So that's really encouraging. And I've heard that Saturday, it will be maybe the biggest rally ever, as far as this demonstration goes. So I hope that trend continues, that people can come together and unite and, push for real change and real reforms and not let, the actions of a few violent folks take the headlines.
Yeah. Just in a very personal way, I have been personally upset over the death of the killing of Mr. Floyd, in part just because the picture of that police officer with his knee on his neck was just personally very viscerally disturbing to me. And then the Lafayette Square situation was also very disturbing, in that peaceful protest is not just a part of our political tradition, but it's interesting because when we think about the First Amendment and the rights protected in the First Amendment, we often focus on free speech and the religion clauses, but peaceful assembly is right there in the First Amendment, and I think that's important, and it's I'm glad to hear that seem. Would it be fair to say that the right of peaceful protest is something that's an important priority for senators on both sides of the aisle?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And, this was truly, I think, this wasn't something where people got a heads up or people knew it was coming. We were all watching it at the same time. And I think, it's very problematic, the reaction. And I think you've heard that really from members on both sides of the aisle. So I don't think it's a partisan issue.
Yeah. So are issues relating to policing and some of these issues, do those come within your legislative portfolio?
Yeah, they do. These are complicated issues. Oftentimes they span, kind of many different areas. I will say, from an Ohio perspective, as we've had similar to kind of like, the mass shooting cases, you kind of have different, you take different steps after, you have different situations that cause you to look at what's happening then and where you've been and where you want to go. And just in the time that I've worked for Senator Portman, I go back to the 2014, the shooting of Tamir Rice in Cleveland. That was the shooting of a 14-year-old who was, somebody had called the cops, said it looked like a kid had a gun in a park. The officers, gunned him down. There were some riots. There was a big response. That was one that really stuck out in my mind. And that was, I remember in the aftermath of that, we were having a lot of the same conversations that we're having now. Use of force, what's appropriate, how the criminal process works for charging officers, how that can be quickly done. And then, broadly, with the individual handling of these cases by police departments, is there a role of the federal government to come in for civil rights violations? And so, that was one that I think if I had to point to, like when we started looking at these issues, that was definitely a point where we started saying, okay, like what's the federal role in this and what's the response? Certainly at the time, the Obama administration, they developed a lot of administrative policies. The Department of Justice was very active in enforcing consent decrees in cities. They really took it on. There was a lot of guidance. There were changes to some of the funding programs, burn JAG, cops, trying to get an increase in training, and also to promote an idea of community policing. So where we are now, I think that it's it's frustrating that we're still kind of having these conversations about what can be done and what the solutions are. But I think there also should be a recognition that as people have become more familiar with these things, that can be, that's changed minds. And there is something to be said, at least in Washington, which I will say legislating and things that come up, they do tend to be kind of behind the population, behind where the population is, I think, of American culture. So, but I think people have just over the years grown more familiar with these kinds of issues, and there's just been a stronger recognition. And I think that's one of the reasons why you're seeing across all political spectrums, really the unanimous outrage to what happened to George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and others, and a real, kind of coming together to say, what do we do now?
Right. And it's a challenging, obviously very challenging problem to address legislatively from the federal government perspective, right? So what are some of the you've alluded to some of them, but what are some of the strategies that that the federal government can take to approach these issues? Because many of these are there's a very strong state layer, right? I mean, police are municipal employees, typically governed primarily by state law, right? So as a so you're a legislative aide in the Senate. What are some of the things that are in your toolkit to be able to get at issues like this?
Yeah, so the major way that the federal government tries to control what state and local governments do is funding. And so I think what you're going to see is, probably a push for increased funding for body cameras, increased funding for police training, maybe increased funding for minority police recruitment, some of these kinds of things that, you can put dollars behind. I think you could also see some strings attached to funding to make sure that if a law enforcement agency is getting, say, COPS funding or burn JAG, that they're required to report on officer incidents that involve bodily harm, or they're required to, to do certain trainings. So that's kind of in one bucket. And, the money pot, that's always there, right? And it's kind of funny because you've got, oftentimes on many issues, not just this, but, the Democrats will say, okay, let's just, more money, more money. Republicans are, kind of in the camp of maybe less money. But I think when we look at this, there is a recognition that we could probably incentivize state and local governments to do more, to be, to kind of start correcting this through the, through the purse strings, and Congress holds that. I will say, on some of the other policies, there have been bills introduced. There was a bill introduced earlier this week that would have basically amended federal criminal code to ensure that choking is a form of excessive force. So that's, one avenue. You could also, you could look at, okay, are there ways that we can make things a crime and add that in a statute? The other issue that I think is going to be really interesting is looking at qualified immunity. And this is one where, the history of it, it was kind of initially drafted to create a cause of action against a government entity, a person who was violating constitutional rights. It's been interpreted largely by the courts and extended over the years to include protecting, instead of actually creating a cause of action, but protecting and giving immunity for individuals under the basis that they were acting reasonably, even though they were mistaken. And it's, since I think the early 2000s, that's been one of the primary ways that law enforcement officers who are accused of wrongdoing have been able to kind of not be found liable. And so I think that's something where Congress has a real role to play. And it's interesting because you have an initial statute that's basically not even in line with where the, how it's applied right now and how it's been interpreted through the courts. So it's the idea that Congress would go back and look at that original intent as it's been interpreted and do a further clarification.
Yeah, and so, and that's really helpful for people to know, is that the doctrine of qualified immunity, which as has been interpreted, as you say, by the courts, to effectively be very protective of police, because as long as police can, among other things, articulate some kind of reasonable fear or something like that, they're often the way the qualified immunity case of been interpreted, they're found not liable, and that affects jury instructions and also all sorts of things. But that is the product of legislation. That's not the product of any kind of, it's not a constitutional right, it's a product of legislation. So Congress can change that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you think that that's an issue that will get some attention in the near future?
I do. I think that because it is so out of step with kind of what the original statute looked like, that there's going to be a real, kind of people are coalescing around the idea that we should really go back and address it. I saw that there was a bill introduced in the House. It was bipartisan. I think a couple of days ago, it went into the statute and kind of did like a clarification paragraph underneath it. So, there could be various ways to look at it. Some people might just want to scrap it entirely. Other people might want to go into, that provision or another provision in the law. But I think that's something that'll be addressed.
Well, great, thanks. So let's transition a little bit to COVID. And so we'll just, rather than go back 2 weeks in time, let's go back a couple months in time. And just kind of chronologically a little bit, how it impacted, I guess you personally, maybe, but in your work life, right, when it started coming onto your radar as a legislative staff person and started becoming an issue that senators and representatives were really starting to focus on.
Yeah. So, I'll even start a little bit before then. So as January started, the Senate was knee deep in impeachment trials. And so that took up all of January. The final vote in the Senate on acquittal was on February 5th. And so right after impeachment, I will say the morale in the Senate was probably the lowest I've ever seen it. It was ugly. It was, kind of, people felt defeated, people were exhausted. Everybody was kind of like, okay, how do we need a break. And it was right then that I think, people started actually looking at the threat of COVID. So when it was in China and when we had the cruise ship and people were being isolated, it was less of a concern. I remember talking to my colleagues who cover healthcare, and there were occasional briefings that we would be, kind of given an update on, and it felt like it was something we were going to avoid. That was truly the understanding, I think, from a lot of people, and probably people around the country. And so then when it went to Europe and when we started seeing what happened in Italy, I think that was the first point that people realized this is not something that we're going to be able to avoid. And so that would have been, end of February, beginning of March. Everything still felt pretty normal until the week of, I think it was March 8th or March 9th. That was the week on the 11th that the president gave his Wednesday night address. It was the evening they canceled the NBA season. And as, most everybody felt around the country, it just felt very surreal to be kind of watching this and imagining what life would be like shut down. Even still at the time, we had our last, so the Portman staff, we have a staff meeting once a week, normally on Monday afternoons. That week, the Monday meeting was normal. We had a meeting on that Thursday the 12th, and it was with Senator Portman, and we all sat around our conference table, probably 25 people in the room, and, kind of walked through what we knew. And at that time it was, well, we don't know really how contagious it is. You probably don't need to wear a mask. It's not really impacting children, and we're just going to kind of learn. And the advice then was just like, wash your hands and stay home if you're sick. And so that was what we went on. At that point, we made a decision, probably maybe a week ahead of other offices, to go and work remotely. And for people who, are used to working remotely, perhaps that was, something that was easier to do. I will say in the Senate, there is no telework policy. Like, no one in the chamber, staffer or members, works remotely ever. You're there or you're not there. And so it was a really big adjustment. And so that Friday the 13th, that was the day everything really changed. That was the day daycares were closed. So I have a 1.5-year-old, and that was like the last normal day. So starting on Monday the 16th, everybody was home with their kids, schools were closed, daycares were closed, and all of a sudden we were working in the new normal. So part of the challenge of this also was that, Congress was really trying to get a response package very quickly. And if you follow, this is not a body that works where things get done on a fast basis. But the timeline that we got for the first couple coronavirus relief packages was astounding. So work from home really began on the 16th. The first vote on the COVID relief package was on March 18th. That was the bill that included 14 days paid leave. It included free testing. It included changes to FMLA and also an increase in food stamps. The next bill that passed, the major bill, was March 25th. And that is the bill that included the increase in unemployment benefits. It was the multi-trillion-dollar bill, the Paycheck Protection Program, and the individual kind of stimulus money to households. So during that time, those bills were really negotiated between the majority leader of the House and the majority leader of the Senate, and the committees, kind of mostly the Finance Committee and then the Ways and Means Committee. And so those really didn't involve a lot of feedback from individual members. You really had to pick what your priority was. Senator Portman's priority in that space was actually the $600 unemployment insurance supplement from the federal government. So that was the piece that we really worked on and that we still kind of have invested a lot of our time in. But most of the rest of the bill, it just, things just got in, and then you look at it afterwards and you look at implementation, and, everybody's kind of doing the work on the back end rather than crafting, carefully crafting legislation.
So Katie, there are a whole bunch of questions that come to mind, but one just on that last point, the legislative process is usually not very rapid, and that can be frustrating for a lot of folks sometimes, but part of that is you're trying to get the language right, and in a big, thick bill, that second, the big COVID relief bill, how many pages was that legislation?
Oh, thousands, I'm sure.
Right, so it's really long, right? And so these are really thick stacks of paper if you printed them out, and when you're trying to do that quickly, that's got to be an incredible challenge. To do sophisticated legislation quickly. I'm sure things get in there. I'm sure the drafting is not always what people would like it to be. How do you manage that? Or I guess you just manage it the best you can, but how do you manage that?
Well, I think the biggest challenge is when you don't have the time to actually draft the legislation with the intent of Congress and to kind of check all the boxes, you leave it up to the agencies when they're implementing it, and sometimes they get it right, and then sometimes they get it wrong, and that's really frustrating because then you have to either use your office to try to work with the agency to get clarifications, to get guidance, to get corrections, or you have to go back and revisit the actual legislation and then put that in there. And I have a good example of that that we've been working on and that I've taken the lead on in our office in the Paycheck Protection Program, which is the loans for small businesses. Congress had left it very open-ended. They gave, anybody could apply. There was a lot of attention. It was, big and small businesses, and it was meant to be a really broad relief package. So in the implementation of that, one of the things that the Small Business Administration did was they put a restriction in there so that nobody who had a felony conviction ever, could apply. They also limited it based on some other offenses. So, that's an example where, we do a lot of work on prisoner reentry. We do a lot of work on kind of second chances and employers who are, coming out and starting small businesses. That's an example where, Congress didn't intend to restrict those funds or to cut those people off from being able to be eligible, but the Treasury Department and the Small Business Administration did. And so we've had to urge them, we've urged Secretary Mnuchin, we've urged people at the White House to make this correction administratively. They're refusing to do it. So we have to then go back to the legislation. And so we introduced a bill yesterday that would do just that, remove that felony restriction. So, you get those kinds of situations where you have to, it just creates more work. Where if Congress would have just been clear in the beginning about who qualified and that they couldn't, restrict it based on certain factors, then we wouldn't be in this situation.
Right. But again, if you're trying to act very quickly, inevitably your legislation is not going to be everything that you would like it to be in an ideal world.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, speaking of COVID legislation, so there were those two bills. What's the current status on follow-up bills? I will certainly say, as an employee of a state institution of higher education, relief for states would certainly be, I'm sure, very welcome throughout the country. There was a flurry of activity, but it seems like we're in a little bit of a pause. Is there any insight you can share about that?
Yeah, so the House passed their bill, which is COVID Phase 4, which is called the HEROES Act. And, it's a huge bill. It has a lot of things that are COVID related. It has a lot of things that are not COVID related. And the Senate has kind of said they have kind of hit pause for a couple of reasons. One, the money from the previous CARES Act for state and local governments hasn't gone out in its entirety in most cases. So in Ohio, that money actually had to go to the legislature in the state, and then there was, a whole process to actually get it out to the locals. And so, that's a challenge. I think, one of the things that we're looking at is where are we going to be in July? Where are the needs going to be, and how broad does this need to be? So I think. Hopefully we'll get a better sense of that. But that's been really the pause, is that we don't really know what we're going to need in this next COVID relief package, and we'd like to have a better idea. So that work will continue. I think we'll probably have something passed around the 4th of July, probably before the 4th of July. The Senate right now, so the House has gone to remote voting, which is really interesting. They were able to do that in a rule change, so they don't physically have to be there. They will not be in session again until, I believe, the end of June. And so the House is out. They passed their bill, the HEROES bill, and then they left town. The Senate has been in session. We went back into session this week. We'll be in session until the 4th of July. And so this is the work period where you're going to see something get done over here. The Senate has not gone to remote voting. And that's really another interesting thing to talk about. Senator Portman actually introduced a bill with Senator Durbin, who's the whip. And what that bill would do is it would allow 30 days of remote voting if there is a pandemic, the authority given jointly to the majority leader and the minority leader. But, unclear if there's a path forward for that. But the Senate has been in session. The committees are starting to function, and they are starting to do different hearings and markups. Separate and apart from the next COVID relief package, we have the appropriations bills for the next fiscal year moving forward. So fiscal year ends September 30th. And so I think the other thing, if we do get in a place where you don't see movement on a broader bill, I think what you will see is plus ups in in different pots for the appropriations. So still to be determined, but when people come and ask me, okay, like we need 200 million for X program and it's in the House HEROES bill, my first thing that I tell them is you've got to have a dual track on this. Make sure you're working with appropriators, make the case that this is what's needed in the next fiscal year to respond from COVID, and you could get that, inserted there. So that said, the Senate is expected to go out of session during the August recess time, and then we'd come back in September. So we're on a limited timeline, but I do expect, as of like yesterday, the conversations around the next COVID response package, they have been moving forward. I think they are becoming productive. And I think my guess is that we will see that relief package, before the 4th of July.
Yeah. Okay. And so the remote voting is really interesting, right? How our legislature is not designed to operate during a pandemic. I was also thinking, though, when you mentioned that earlier that Congress, the Senate, there's no, there wasn't a work from home policy, right? It strikes me that, and it's something that you and I, when we've chatted in the past, you talked about, a huge part of the way things actually get done is through personal relationships, right? You have personal relationships with staffers. And my impression is that physically being there, like you see people, you occasionally grab lunch with people, and these individual relationships are really important to get things done. And that must be a really an additional hurdle in the current environment, right? You can't just, do you ever just walk down the hall to talk to a staffer in another senator's offices?
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
that's exactly right. Like, you pick up a phone, people's direct dials, everyone is like accessible. You run in the cafeteria, you see 5 people who you've been meaning to ask, 5 different things to, and you get your answers. That's the kind of place that it is. And, members also, so from a staff perspective, it's really, really hard to work remotely. In our office setup, our whole legislative shop of about 14 people, we're all in like basically 3 rooms that are connected. And so there's constant, strategizing and checking in and monitoring what's happening on the floor. And, we're all kind of in it together. And working remotely, you don't get a sense of any of that. It's also, really challenging, I think, for members of Congress because they're also used to being, briefed one-on-one, of being able to call all their staff in to talk about an issue. And it's a challenge. So now we're operating in a world of, a lot of daily calls, a lot of conference calls, trying to be, over, I try to loop more people in than necessary just because I don't want to, leave anyone out. But it's tough. Also, not to mention, when we went to working remotely, I mean, a good portion of offices didn't even have, laptops with access to Senate documents. So that's a challenge. And then just kind of logistically with the Senate rules, the Senate it's a deliberative body with all of these like incredible rules about procedure and process. And that's been a challenge. So even introducing a bill, how do you do that if you are not there personally to walk it down to the Senate floor, to hand it to the staff so that it's introduced? It's really, really hard. So right now, just to like give you a glimpse, our whole staff is working remotely with the exception of the senator's personal aide who kind of helps get him things that he needs. And so, most senators, I will say, like, don't actually walk down and introduce their bills themselves, and now they have to. So they're signing them, they're walking them down, they're adding co-sponsors, they're adding themselves as co-sponsors of other bills. It's
are in the Senate offices now, and the Senate chamber, is it mostly just the senators, right, and maybe their personal aide? So typically there would be predominantly staffers, right? But now the senators are there and very few other people.
Yeah, so the halls of Congress, I mean, they are normally open to the public. So at the same time that people are there working, you normally have thousands of people go through a day for Senate tours. And they're right below the Capitol in what's called the visitor center. So, that's one of the things that I love about working in Congress is that it truly has always felt like it's the people's house. And you can be, visiting Washington with your kids on spring break and see senators, walking right by you. So right now in the halls, it's senators. I will say maybe 1 or 2 aides per senator max. You've got the staff of the cloakroom for the Republican and Democratic side, and the floor staff. So on the Senate floor, of course, you have people who are running the floor, the operations. Each party has a cloakroom that's kind of in charge of introducing the bills from that party and making sure that things are filed correctly, and also following the rules and different procedural things. And then just senators and press. The press have been allowed, so you will see them, but everyone is I was in the office last week. You hardly see anyone. Capitol Police are there. Everyone is social distancing. Everybody is wearing masks.
Yeah. Okay. Well, good. Let me ask a couple of quick questions that I can see as audience questions, and then I'll turn it over to Heather to ask other ones. So one issue, I know the Senate Majority Leader has talked about this, is in the next COVID bill, having some kind of limited liability protection for businesses that could be seen as gutting safety for workers and customers. The question asks, is this being pushed by insurance companies? What's the thinking on that particular issue?
So this is one, right? The majority leader has been really vocal. In fact, I mean, I think he has said that the Senate will not take up something if it doesn't have protections for employers. It's going to be a balancing act. I think that, as we've talked to businesses across Ohio, and I can really only speak to, the folks who we've engaged in, but as we talk to people, everybody wants guidance. They want to know, how do we do it right? What are the steps that we can take to be responsible so that we aren't, on the hook if somebody gets sick? I don't know to what extent we're going to kind of see this. The HELP Committee, which is the Health, Education, Labors, and Pensions Committee, is starting to look at proposals to take up. It's going to be definitely a partisan fight, and it's just unclear how broad that's going to be. But you could see something that's more limited. I also think it's going to be hard to address because different sectors are so different. How do you look at the nursing home, associations and what they're operating as, and then you look at universities, or you look at fast food or businesses that are deemed essential or non-essential. And so it's not it's really not clear how that's going to be processed, but I expect that there will be something in there. The extent, I'm just not sure.
And one other thing related to COVID and elections, does Senator Portman have a position on supporting mail voting, especially in a pandemic, right? And it was really interesting to see in the Wisconsin election, right, and people having to choose between their personal safety and exercising their right to vote.
Yeah, it's the election, that we could have a whole conversation about that separately. I think that, once again, this is an issue where states have most of the authority to kind of craft their systems, and you don't really have, a federal role per se in how states are operating elections. We really, we like to push how Ohio has responded with colleagues from other states and looking at solutions. I think the key to this is going to be early voting, options for absentee ballots, trying to get that out to as many people as possible, and just trying to let people know that, in Ohio, you don't have to have an excuse. You don't have to be deployed in the military or be traveling for work or any of those things. So I think what Senator Portman would say is that we'd like to see other states kind of look at states who have not been as progressive with early voting or mail-in voting. Look to the states that have done it and done it well, and you've got a bunch to look at. So I think Ohio's been a really good example of early voting and kind of making sure that things are accessible 30 days, 45 days before an election, so people can go vote and maybe socially distance if they want to do that, or request an absentee. And then you've got states like Washington that have been voting by mail for years. And have no problems. But the really challenging part of this, I think, is that it takes a long time. DC just had an election on Tuesday, and there were major problems with, they had kind of sent an absentee ballot out to everyone. There were problems at the last minute. There were software issues. And so, there were people in my office and colleagues who said, I think I'm just going to have to go vote because I'm not confident that the absentee voting is something that is going to work given, and the mayor of DC acknowledged that. So I think there's going to be, it's going to be kind of a mad rush to November. And I think the hope is that people can get there, but there's just a lot of uncertainty.
Thanks, Heather. Let me turn it over to you for some questions from the audience.
So we have some piling up, and Megan, some of them are from the earlier points about racial inequity and violence there. So this question is, has the senator spoken out about his upset over the behavior of the Trump administration over the Monday removal of protesters and Trump's march to St. John's Church with the unfortunate participation of the U.S. military? I believe that I saw that Senator Portman had made a statement, but I don't know if it was specific to this.
Yeah, if I can remember, and please don't hold this against me, and certainly nothing I say should be attributed to, Senator Portman. But he did say he thought it was inappropriate, and I think a lot of members, including my boss, Senator Portman, are really trying to look at who made the call to use that kind of force, and trying to build in some accountability. But yeah, it was not. It is not something that he thought was appropriate, and it's disturbing.
This question goes back to COVID-related issues. I know someone whose SBA loan in the COVID-19 pandemic was refused for credit history. Is that reasonable given the 43 million who have lost their jobs and businesses left and right will be going bankrupt?
Yeah, this is another area where, because of the rush to stand up this program, you've seen implementation that's probably outside of the intent of Congress. And they probably should not have been, disqualified based on that. So, it's an unintended consequence of a program that, we stood up too quickly. I will say there were some changes that passed earlier this week, in particular with the Paycheck Protection Program, so that recipients would have 12 weeks instead of the initial 8 weeks to bring everybody back and continue to pay them. That was one of the criteria for getting a loan forgiven, but it's an ongoing challenge. We have had numerous conversations with SBA and also Treasury to try to make some of these clarifications and work out some of the kinks.
Thanks. I want to come back and touch base on some of the Supreme Court decisions that you thought would be coming up. And I know that you had some particular positions, and Senator Portman did as well. So do you want to address some of those?
Yeah, so this is kind of like my hat on. Not speaking to the senator, but I think this is, and I had thought this since the beginning of the year, but this is really going to be an interesting summer when you look at the cases that are up before the Supreme Court. We have all kinds of issues that have been very politically sensitive, very strong political opinions on both sides that are coming up. And two that I think will be the most notable would be the decision on DACA and whether the Trump administration could in fact rescind the Obama-run program, and the other one being the Title VII employment protections for folks based on gender discrimination and whether that counts as sex discrimination. So everybody has their alarm clock set out here who cover these issues for their bosses, on Monday mornings, because we expect that these are going to come down at any time. I would say before COVID. Before COVID and kind of the situation that we're in now with race relations, my thought really would have been that you would see Congress in perhaps both of these cases, but at least one, probably with DACA, you'd see a very swift reaction if in fact those protections were not held up for the DACA recipients. So on DACA, this is one where I think if the court were to agree that Trump could end the program, and all of a sudden you have all of these DACA recipients who are now, uncertain if they can stay in the country, I think what you would see from Congress is a push to codify the Obama regulations that came out and to make sure that there's something in statute. That's something that Senator Portman hasn't actually introduced in the past couple of Congresses. We think it's a start. There are other issues. There are issues with parents. There are issues with whether DACA recipients can, have a path to full citizenship. I think the first thing that we would like to see would just be those immediate protections, and that's something that I think could really, it could pass quickly. And I think that the president and the administration would actually be behind that. So that's one that. That you could see kind of take priority in the next couple of weeks that maybe in general Americans aren't really paying attention to right now. And then with regard to the protections included in for sex discrimination, I think this is another one that's going to be really interesting. So you've got 3 cases that the court is considering with in one case, and all of them are really relying on how different administrations have interpreted sex discrimination. And certainly in the Obama years, the EEOC took a much broader view that would include gender discrimination. The Trump administration has chosen not to do that. And this is really an interesting question before the courts. I think the expectation on this one is that, the people are anticipating that the court will find that it does not include gender discrimination. And so you could see a legislative response to this too, of going back into, the 1964 legislation and further clarifying, just adding that in as a category so that it follows, discrimination based on sex rather than it being included in sex discrimination. So both of these also, I should mention, these are issues that the House has already taken up. They've passed legislation. So there could be a push for the Senate to take up either that legislation, or you could see the Senate respond in maybe a narrower approach based on what the court decision is to address it, but not in such a comprehensive way as the House has done.
So speaking of the Supreme Court, there's a question about the case on ending the Affordable Care Act. If I'm correct, that's not at the Supreme Court right now, is it? Weren't they going to defer that till after the election?
I believe so.
Right.
Yeah.
So that I think that'll happen, but I just thought it was really interesting the way that that was not fast tracked, and that I think is going to be maybe the next term. That sound right?
I think that's right.
Yeah. So it's also interesting in all of these issues that these are issues where the court is interpreting statute. Again, there's not really a constitutional angle. The question is, what's the intent of Congress? Is there a sense that, I'm just curious, is there a sense that the Supreme Court really tries to seriously figure out what Congress intended? Or has that kind of gone by the wayside and they're just reaching their own decisions based on, I don't know, statutory language or whatever, and leaving it to Congress to clean up things that it needs to clean up?
Yeah, when I listened to some of the oral arguments in this and some of the questions on these cases, and you do get quite a few questions from some of the justices on original intent. I also, though, you have especially in the employment discrimination, I mean, I think there were a number of justices who kind of said, okay, like, yes, you've got the original intent in 1964 and what people considered sex then, and most people probably agree that it was male female, but where are we now? And like I said, I think that it'll be really interesting. I mean, I don't have a clear idea on how things will go, and I'm really curious to read the opinions and see kind of what they lay out as things that Congress needs to either clarify or changes that we need to make. But both of these have very clear legislative hooks that we can, Congress can and should go in and address this if these are issues that are unclear. And so and I think both both of these, I think, are things that like I said, can be done. It may not be as broadly as, maybe the more progressive, Democrats or liberals would want, but I think that even, there are things that can be addressed. And I'm really interested to see, just from like a politics perspective, how this plays with, with the American people. I think that's going to determine, if you get these decisions and kind of nobody's paying attention and, they're swept under the rug for now, then it's less likely that you're going to see action from Congress. If you get these decisions and all of a sudden there's outrage, oh my gosh, people who are transgender are not covered, people who are gay are not covered by, by employment discrimination protections, if these things cause outrage, I think there's no question that it's going to be addressed. And furthermore, I mean, this is, not my official hat, but on the politics side, it'll be really interesting to see how the Trump administration responds. There have been a lot of issues where they are really out of step with where traditionally Republicans have been, and kind of, just go there. So I don't know what their advisors will say, but I could envision a scenario where you see these, DACA kids left out, and you see these protections not extended, and the president just says, forget it, like, do it.
Yeah. So it's interesting. So I would imagine as a staffer or as a senator, there you have your job is legislation. There are certain things that are maybe personally important to you. You have particular goals, but can you speak to the degree to which things like public outrage and public pushback drive the legislative agenda? Do they or do they not? Like, so you're saying, and so it's sometimes a question as an ordinary American citizen, right? Like, what actually drives Congress to act in a particular way at a particular time?
So from my experience, they do until you get a bill that is too extreme. And then people get in their camps. And, I've seen this. I've worked on the gun issues, the mass shootings, of course, the other situations. And, there's the moment where you have the outrage, you have the discussions, everybody's talking. And then there's the moment of kind of like the breaking point where everyone goes in their direction. You've seen it in immigration too. And it's hard because as much as people, do want, the priorities for their base. I mean, the only way that we're going to get at good solutions and good policy is really working together. So it's hard, but I do think that the outrage, that definitely does make a push, but you kind of know when things are going to fail. So back like in the Obama years, when they pushed the gun votes on the floor, I mean, there was no doubt that those votes were not gonna, that bill was not gonna pass. And that's sad in my mind, because I think that advocacy is like such an incredible and important thing for Americans and people to be involved. And frankly, some of the groups that, push advocates are not transparent with them about the prospects of actually getting something across the finish line. And I think that's really disheartening. I think they need to be a little more upfront and telling people what's realistic and what's not realistic, because unless you get to 60 votes in the Senate, and that's going to require support from both parties, you're not going to get a bill passed.
Let's add just one last COVID-related question that just popped up about broad COVID-19 testing being available and PPE. It's actually interesting to me to ask, what's your sense of availability, but also from a legislative perspective, right? Because really, it seems to me that an awful lot of those issues effectively would be in the executive, securing and encouraging testing. But from your perspective as a legislator, where are working in the legislative branch, where are we on testing? Where do you think we're going?
Yeah, I mean, Senator Portman has been really straightforward that the coordinated response of the federal government has failed at this, whether it's the national stockpile or whether it's testing or whether it's PPE. I mean, those have been really glaring, mistakes that have been taken. Even the coronavirus task force, that should be a function of the Secretary of the Health and Human Services Department. He was kind of cut out from the beginning, and it's just really been a debacle. I think one thing that you'll see that's going to be interesting, and we've started kind of to do it from oversight, but really developing a better coordination at the federal level so that when we have the next pandemic, it's a coordinated response. Testing, it's just varied so much in states and different areas. Like in DC right now, they finally have enough tests so that anybody can go and get a test. And testing locations pretty much throughout the city. And in Ohio, I think that, there's also a wide variety of tests. PPE, I mean, one of the other concerns that we have about that is the fact that so much of it was manufactured in China, and we literally do not have a domestic supply to be able to kind of arm our own citizens. And so that's something that we're looking at, I think, from a trade perspective, and how we can incentivize American companies to manufacture some of this so that we don't have to be reliant on other countries. So I think you're going to see kind of a federal response on those ends, but by and large, this is another issue that the money went down to the states for these purposes, and they really have most of the discretion.
Okay, thanks. So we're pretty much at the top of the hour, so we should wrap up. May, it's so good to see you, and thank you so much for participating. It was a really great discussion. So thanks for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. It's been an honor.
Yeah, and be well and be safe, and we'll look forward to seeing you soon.
You all too. Okay. Take care.
Take care,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Thank you, Heather.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks.
Bye.